A very warm welcome to this revision video about the experience of German people under the Nazis. This revision video is going to focus on the economic changes that were brought about in Germany in the 1930s. We're going to look at the benefits and the drawbacks. We're going to talk about employment and how the Nazis tackled unemployment. We look at public works programs, rearmament, self-sufficiency, and the impact of the Second World War on the German economy and the German people, including looking at the impact of bombing raids, rationing, labour shortages, and refugees. So, without further ado, let's find out more. Off we go. Okay, so the economy was a really important issue for the Nazis to tackle when they came into power in January 1933. Remember, the Nazis had promised work and bread. And you can see this statistic in terms of the reduction in unemployment in Germany. And in fact, by the time we get to 1939, there's actually a labour shortage in Germany. So some of the key ways in which the Nazis reduce unemployment is, firstly, through their public works programs. So they built around about 2,000 miles of autobahns, which were built mainly without machines in order to create more jobs for people. And they build new infrastructure across Germany, such as railways, canals and bridges, as well as new homes, hospitals and schools. And this all creates jobs across Germany during this time. So the Nazis had other strategies in terms of reducing unemployment. So they had an organisation called the RAD, the National Labour Service. And the National Labour Service basically made it compulsory from 1935 for all 19 to 25-year-old men to do 6 months labour service. So it extended to women by 1939. Now, the workers would work on big sort of projects, so it might be digging ditches, building flood defences, doing agricultural work, planting trees in forests. It's that type of thing, and they got very little money for this, but they just got their food and accommodation. And when we talk about accommodation, we kind of mean sort of like tents and stuff like that. The conditions were really strict, and it was basically a cheap way of creating labour, but also it helped to reduce unemployment quite extensively. Rearmament. In 1935, Hitler announced that Germany was openly rearming and would raise the numbers in the army from the 100,000 under the Treaty of Versailles to around about 750,000. So the government was spending lots of money on rearmament. Now, under the 4-year plan that was brought in 1936, there was a big focus on rearmament, and this meant lots of money, huge amount of government spending was going on new weapons and military uniforms. Industry and things like iron, steel and chemicals grew. Lots and lots of big businesses were directing their focus on rearmament now as well, and that was creating lots of jobs. The other tactic the Nazis used to reduce unemployment was a bit of a fiddling of the statistics, really. So women were obviously pressured to give up work once Hitler came into power, and that was part of the Nazi social policies towards women. Jews were not counted in unemployment statistics, and then in 1935, obviously, the conscription was brought in for men from 18 to 25 and 2 years military service. So this all helped to reduce unemployment massively. Okay, so the Nazis had various economic policies during this time. So when the Nazis came to power, a man called Hjalmar Schacht was put in charge of the economy, and he came up with an economic plan which was known as the quote New Plan. Well, it was called the New Plan, and the focus was all about reducing unemployment. Then Hjalmar Schacht fell out with the Nazis, and in 1936 Hermann Göring, who you can see pictured there, he was put in charge of a new 4-year economic plan to make Germany ready for war. And the focus of it was to do two things, basically, to rearm Germany and to make Germany self-sufficient. Remember, in the First World War, Germany had been hampered by the British blockade, and so there was a desire to make sure that Germany could be self-sufficient. So within that idea of the 4-year plan was this whole idea of guns versus butter. So Hermann Göring focused the economy on guns versus butter, which meant that he said basically to the German people that the focus of the economy needs to be about rearming Germany rather than people buying consumer goods. And we can see there that, as I said before, there was the tension between Schacht and Göring. And by 1937, Göring was making all the important economic decisions. So it's really important in this course to understand how different policies affect the different lives of different groups of people. So let's start off by looking at big business. Factories and big businesses benefit greatly from Nazi policies, largely because they destroyed the power of the trade unions, which had been fairly powerful in the Weimar Republic. In May 1933, Hitler got rid of trade unions and replaced them with the German Labour Front, which was a Nazi organisation. It's known as the DAF. Now, this led to lower wages for workers, longer working hours, because big businesses could do this and because they didn't have to fear strikes anymore. Rearmament policies also benefited some big businesses such as Daimler-Benz, who made aeroplanes, for example, and generally, the sort of big iron and steel and coal companies, things like that, made quite a lot of money during the Nazi years, largely because of the sort of focus of the economy on rearmament. Now, small businesses actually did pretty badly from Nazi policies. So firms producing consumer goods, they lost money. Small businesses struggled to compete with big business. They reckon around about 300,000 small businesses went bankrupt in Nazi Germany. What about the farmers? Well, the farmers benefited from Nazi policies when Hitler came into power. Their debts were cancelled, food prices were increased. But towards the late 1930s, food prices were controlled, which caused economic problems for farmers. Also, by the late 1930s, farming began to struggle. There were labour shortages, which meant that the farmers struggled to get the workers to work on their farms, and there was poor investment as well, which meant that German farms tended to lag behind other European countries in terms of how productive they were. In terms of the ordinary workers, well, we know that the Nazis promised work and bread when they came to power. Nazi policies created jobs, and there was actually a labour shortage by 1939. Now, workers involved in the armaments industry, they generally got paid pretty well, but other workers saw their wages decrease. So the replacement of trade unions with the German Labour Front, the DAF, meant that workers had very few rights really in Nazi Germany. Workers could get jobs, but they didn't always have a choice about what job they did. So you might have somebody that had quite a well-paid job and maybe lost that during the Great Depression and now was perhaps forced to work building the autobahns or something like that. It wasn't an option to not work, so those who were seen as work shy were sent to concentration camps. Okay, so we mentioned before about the DAF, the German Labour Front. So what was its impact? Well, it was set up on the 10th of May 1933. It was run by a guy called Robert Ley, Ley. Ordinary Germans could not easily get work or job in Germany without being a member. So it had 20 million members by 1939. And a couple of the organisations that were created within the German Labour Front were called Strength Through Joy and the Beauty of Labour. Let's talk about the beauty of labour first. So the beauty of labour was basically set up to improve working conditions. There's very much a philosophy in Nazi Germany that was a beauty in working hard, and there were definitely some people who were bought into the sort of Nazi ideas and were swayed, perhaps indoctrinated by propaganda, that there's this beauty in working hard. Now, the beauty of labour did do a few things, like improve facilities for workers, maybe improve meals in the canteen, or bring in better ventilation in the workplace. But generally, the workers were lucky if they benefited from this, and obviously they had no way of going on strike or protesting if the working conditions weren't good. But the beauty of labour did do a few things to improve working conditions for ordinary German workers. The other organisation, which is really important for you to know about, is called Strength Through Joy. And the idea of Strength Through Joy was to create opportunities for leisure activities for the workers. So it did things like promote sports, it created free leisure facilities such as gym classes, for example. It would create things like art exhibitions, cinema, theatre trips. They would organise concerts, cheap tickets to the opera or the ballet, for example. And also they would arrange cheap holidays such as hiking holidays or cruises. And you can see here an advert for some of the cruises that were put on by Strength Through Joy in the 1930s. So there's no doubt that, obviously it was used for propaganda purposes, but that created a few opportunities for workers in terms of Strength Through Joy. So that's a good example of a piece of change really that was brought in by the Nazis. So ultimately the question is, well, did workers' lives improve under the Nazis? Well, I think when you're looking at this, you've got to remember that workers had no rights. The German Labour Front did what employers wanted, not employees, so workers could not strike. Women were discouraged from working, and many women lost their jobs in the early years of Hitler's rule. Particularly, women lost their jobs as things like teachers and doctors and lawyers, and working in the German civil service, for example. So their lives certainly didn't improve. Many Jewish people were sacked from their jobs when Hitler came to power. Jewish people's businesses were affected by policies such as the boycott of shops that took place in 1933, and there were lots of restrictions on Jewish people owning businesses into the 1930s and what jobs Jewish people could get, so they were really economically disadvantaged. The DAF organised the Volkswagen People's Car Schemes, the idea that you could save tokens up from your wages and eventually get a Volkswagen car, but hardly any workers ever received one. And everyone had to work, so skilled men could be sent to do hard manual work on the autobahns, for example. So I think generally workers' lives didn't improve under the Nazis, would be some of the conclusions we could make there. So one of the things you need to know about is the impact of World War II and how that affected the lives of German people during this time. So in terms of understanding the chronology of the war, well, between 1939 and 1941, the war went pretty well for Germany. They used the blitzkrieg tactic to take control of much of Western Europe. From 1941 to 1943, the tide very much began to turn against Germany, with the Soviet Union and the USA joining the war. And then 1943 to 1944 is known really as the era of total war, lots of fighting in other parts of the world, within Africa, for example, and then 1944, obviously we had D-Day in June 1944, where British, French, British, American and Canadian forces we were able to successfully invade and then slowly retake control of occupied France, and the eventual defeat of Germany in 1945, with Adolf Hitler dying in April 1945 and the war ending in May 1945. So what was the impact of fighting the war? Well, the lives of German people certainly got worse during World War II, and this was due to the demands of fighting this total war. Opposition certainly increased, so we had an increase in just general kind of grumbling. We had things like the Stauffenberg plot in July 1944. We had opposition from people like the White Rose Group at Munich University. Goering's economic targets were not fully met, meaning that Germany was short of products like fuel, oil and steel when the war broke out, and that caused major problems, both in fighting the war but also in helping people's lives back home in Germany during the Second World War. The war initially, as was said, went well, but by 1943 Germany was being driven back, and news about the war going badly began to get through the censors. Morale, support for the war began to drop, and people started to slowly but surely ignore Nazi propaganda, and the opposition began to increase. Okay, so in terms of how World War II affected the lives of German people, there's four really key examples to think about here. Firstly, there's labour shortages. Germany is really short of workers. By 1944, there was a huge 13 million men in the German army. Women and prisoners were made to work. Industry was wholly focused on the war effort. Workers had to work longer hours, 60-hour weeks. Holidays were banned. So lives for workers got incredibly bad during the Second World War. There was food shortages during the Second World War. It led to rationing. Clothes were in short supply. Rationing restricted Germans to a simple diet of bread, potatoes and vegetables. By mid-1944, rations were severely cut. Germany was basically running out of food. In terms of refugee crisis, by 1945, the Allies were advancing east, so many Germans fled west away from the Russian army. There was problems of cold, hunger and disease. Thousands and thousands of German refugees, particularly within the eastern part of Germany, died. There was also the impact of the bombing raids, so the Allies were bombing German cities. By about 1943, British and American bombers were targeting civilians in both day and night raids. 350,000 people were killed, about 780,000 injured, around about 2 million homes were destroyed, and cities such as Cologne and particularly Dresden over in eastern Germany were badly damaged. Dresden, it was particularly very badly bombed towards the end of the war, and this bombing made it really hard to produce goods and transport them across Germany. They reckon about 150,000 people died in Dresden. You can see a picture of the city of Dresden, which is almost completely destroyed during the Second World War. Okay, so thanks for listening to that revision video. Hope you enjoyed it, and good luck. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.